Hi, Pastor Morgan.
Careful.
Can I talk to you, please?
Sure. Good morning, all. You likely have already started discussing the question around the table, so I'm going to be rude and interrupt your conversation for just a second and ask you, if you haven't started discussing the question around your table, to answer the following question. Have you met or heard a missionary speak? What impression did they leave on you? So we will gather again at 9:05. So chat with purpose, and we will reconvene, and I will introduce our speaker, which is Margie Jonell, and I look forward to, and again, once we finish, you can continue the robust conversation, okay? Talk amongst yourselves.
So what was your answer to the question?
Yes. I will be interrupting you again, but for even a better reason this time. I have the privilege of introducing Margie Jonell. Many of you may already know Margie, but the beauty of these forums is we realize there's so much more we get to learn about one another, even if we have been in church together for a while. So here's a little bit about Margie. On August 11th, that's today. Yes. We will hear from Margie Jonell on Where Do I Belong? Influenced by My Four Worlds. Margie has been a member of Calvary since 1977 when her family moved here from Sweden. Margie is an MK, a missionary kid, who spent her first 17 years in China, Sweden, and Japan. She sometimes wonders where she belongs. Margie will talk about how she has been influenced by her four worlds and how her faith has guided her along the way. She is retired from Littleton Public Schools as a school psychologist, bless you, Margie Jonell, but has also had a career as teacher and missionary with the American Baptist Foreign Missionary Society. And so we look forward to hearing from Margie in a bit. Next week, we will hear from Del Walker, and we look forward to hearing from Margie about being a third cultural kid. So Margie, please come forward. Let us welcome her.
My goodness. You know, when you're sitting down to write about your life history, all kinds of thoughts come to your mind. And I know that those of you who have done this talk before have just told me that too, that it's hard to remember. And then you think about this story and this story and this story, and you don't know what to tell the story about. But anyhow, I have worked hard on this, and I've written my script because otherwise I'd be telling you stories that belong in Japan or China or Sweden or someplace. So I'm going to try to be consistent. I want to tell you something about my flags, first of all. I thought I was going to be really cool, and I was going to put a Chinese flag up when I talked about China, a Swedish flag when I talked about Sweden, but they didn't collapse. They collapsed when I did that. And then when I ordered some flags, to my dismay, the package didn't have the Swedish flag in it. So this is my old Swedish flag. And another thing, they didn't have the Taiwan Chinese flag, which was the flag that we lived under. They just had the People's Republic of China flag. So you'll have to excuse the difference here. But anyhow, the problem is too, when you're as old as I am, there's a lot of story to tell and a lot of years to cover. So I will try to keep myself to 45 minutes or so. But the big question is, who am I? And as you can tell by this slide, I don't know for sure sometimes. My own story, I want to start with my paternal grandmother because she was a very strong influence in my life. We either lived very close to her or she lived with us for the first 10 years of my life. So in the 1880s, the Nordic countries in Europe had a very strong interest in Christian missions. The influence was felt by Christians all over Europe, but especially in Sweden. The message was loud and clear. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. My grandmother, Hedvig Lovisa Rinell, she was sort of a cute girl, I thought, was born into this cultural setting in 1867. Even as a young girl, she had a real interest in her heart for mission work, and she had wanted to become a missionary in the Congo. She was born into a Lutheran farm family in Sweden, in the province of Uppland, which is just north of Stockholm. And she went to a teacher's college in Uppsala, got her teaching degree, and then went back to her own community to start teaching little children. Then she started hearing about a group called Baptists. And she said, I'm never going to be one of those, because they were called readers at that time in Sweden. Readers because they read the Bible. What a thought, you know. Yeah. So anyhow, she but of course, her dreams were to go to Congo. And then a young man came to her village, and his name was John Alfred Rennell. He was a seminary student in the Baptist seminary, and he started preaching in her area, and she eventually became a Christian, and he baptized her. Because of her change of affiliation from being a Lutheran to a Baptist, she lost her teaching job because it was not considered appropriate for a non-Lutheran to be a teacher in the school. So she did some other things in her career, but eventually she and grandfather John Alfred ended up in a church in Norway for a while, waiting for their call to go to Congo. But then they got the call that said, "Can you go to China instead?" And of course they said yes. So in 1894, they set sail on a beautiful freighter. They arrived in Shanghai in April of 1894. And let's see the boat. Can we see the next slide? They ended up in Shanghai in 1894, and then they thought, well, where in the world are we going to settle in China? It's such a large country. And they ended up taking another ship going up to Shandong province, and that's where we ended up. And the next slide shows us a picture of Shandong. Shandong is actually very close to Korea, South Korea. Okay. As they arrived in China, my grandmother was 8 to 9 months pregnant on this trip. So she, talks about being seasick on the ship. Maybe it was baby sick, I don't know. But as they arrived in April, my father was born in May of that same year. And the small family settled in Jiaoju, which was a typical Chinese walled city. And the city streets were crowded, dirty, messy, full of people, very different from what she had left behind in Sweden. But after time learning Chinese and also about the customs of China and the cultural differences, she wanted to start her school. But she realized that she couldn't start a school for girls, which was her first love. She had to start with the boys because girls weren't worthy of having an education at that time. So this is a picture of her first 5 students in the mission school that started in 1900. I was actually there for their 110th anniversary when I was there in 2010. So that was sort of cool. Well, eventually the school grew to include girls and Bible women. The women were called Bible women because they were supposed to learn the Bible and then go out into the villages and give their testimonies. And it was only through the Bible women that the missionaries were able to gain entrance into the family homes, because they were foreigners after all. They didn't want these foreigners to come into their homes. But first, these women also had to learn to read. So can you imagine a Swedish teacher who's just learning the language, trying to teach Chinese women how to read their own language? That's sort of a strange thing. But in 1923, Hedvig's dream of having a girls' school building became a reality as well. And this is the only school building that still stands today. And I have been in this building several times in the last several years, and it's a very growing church. And it's not part of the Three Self-Church movement, which is recognized by the party. This is sort of an independent kind of church, getting a lot of support from Taiwan. But they also opened a museum last year when my sister and I were able to go there, and it's a history of the Swedish Baptist mission. So, and in October this year, they will celebrate the 120th anniversary of the first baptism in China. So in addition to her work, Hedvig also raised 5 children. Egron was born first, my father, and his brother Oscar. And the 2 eldest sons, Egron and Oscar, also became missionaries. So they went to Sweden when they were 18 years old, after their education in China was finished, and they worked alongside their parents for the next umpteen years. The other three children, my Aunt Margaret, Edith, and Uncle Eric, ended up going to the United States for their education, and as a result, of course, stayed here. So that became the American part of our family. All of the children attended a school called the China Inland Mission School in Chifu, which on the map of Shandong was the very tip, and it was like a 6 days journey from their home to the school by foot or by donkey or whatever, whatever they used to travel with. Sometimes they could take a ship that went from Qingdao up the coast and to Chifu. These kids all went to school when they were 6 years old. And because of the long distance, of course, they couldn't come home except for Christmas and summer. My dad's first year in school was pretty traumatic because he ended up getting sick. So he was not able to travel home at Christmas time to see his family. And that's another story about the Viking from Sweden who went on a bicycle to see his son, who made the papers. If any of you have seen the movie Chariots of Fire, Eric Liddell, who was the Olympic runner in that movie, also attended Chifu schools, although many years after my parents. My father did. My grandfather, John Alfred, worked in China until 1941 when he passed away. He was 75 years old. They had never intended to go back to Sweden to live. They had even purchased a property where they were going to build a house, and they built a house where they were going to retire for the rest of their life. But he passed away, and I never met him because he was born the year before I was born. He died before I was born. Hedwig retired after 55 years in China and left only when the communists forced our family out. My father came to Sweden speaking Chinese and British English. Beautiful British English, by the way. Now he had to learn Swedish. And after one term as a single missionary, he returned to Sweden and he met my mother, Gerda. They had a very, very quick romance. They met in February in a church, and it must have said click. They got engaged, and my dad returned to China in June. Okay, this is pretty short notice. My mother's family called him the bandit from China who stole their daughter. So she had to complete her education, both in a seminary, and also she had to travel to England to learn English, because that was something that she didn't know right then. But wars were going on around the world, and she was not able to go to China as they had planned in a year or so. She traveled to China on a Trans-Siberian railway after 4 long years of separation from a man that she hardly knew. And one can call my mom crazy or daring or courageous, I'm not sure which. Who would meet a man in February, get engaged, have her fiance travel back to China, not to see each other for 4 years, and then meet each other again after a long separation, and get married and begin a life in China, in a country that she had never seen before? I think it was a God thing. Both of them felt the call to be missionaries, and they dedicated their lives to service. And things turned out well. Look at me. And in time of dangers, their faith really kept them in balance. My sister Alice and John, and brother John, were born in 1931 and 1934. And then came the unexpected surprise. Here I am. I was born 12 and 9 years later. And here's a picture of me sitting on my grandmother's lap. And she was the oldest Ronell, I was the youngest. Now, our 3 Ronell families lived right next to each other pretty much. My aunt and uncle and my cousins lived in a house on the same property as my family did. Our grandparents lived about a 15-minute walk away from us. And the school buildings where my grandmother and my parents taught were adjacent to our property. So it was pretty idyllic, wouldn't you say? You have your whole family there. We were thousands of miles away from other family and friends, or my parents' and grandparents' friends, but we were together, 24/7 pretty much. So we could run in between our houses and have family time. But it wasn't all peace and happiness. We did not live in peace. My grandparents and parents lived through some very, very tough years. You could say that there was a war going on from 1900 to 1949. They lived through the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, and that was when the Chinese were killing missionaries by the thousands. They lived through the World War I, through skirmishes between warlords and bandits, like my dad, no, and the Japanese occupation, World War II, the conflict between the communists and the nationalist armies, and finally the brutal takeover of the Communist Party. So sometimes I wonder how in the world our family made it out without losing anyone in our family to enemy fire. As a young child, from birth to 5.5, I had a pretty sheltered life in spite of all the wars that were going on. I played in our yard. I played with my Chinese friends. I always had protection around me. I only remember a time or two when I was afraid. Because of the wars, we were isolated from others. Mail service between Sweden, the US, and China could take up to half a year to get to us. This picture I have to show. Can you tell who I am? This is my kindergarten class, and I want you to remember this little guy. His name is Feng, and I will show a picture of him as he looks today, later on. So the next picture shows our family home with a church behind it. The Swedish flag was painted on our roof to warn off Japanese attackers and later Chinese soldiers, to tell them that we were a neutral country and they could not bomb our property. Many of all of our American, German, and other friends were incarcerated in camps during in the 45, 46, 47, but we were not. A couple of stories from my earliest memories. It was during the time of the struggle between the nationalist and communist armies. We never knew quite who was going to be in our city at any given time. One day I was talking to some nationalist soldiers. Now, that was my first language, Chinese, right? I spoke the dialect of our town. One day I was talking to some of these national soldiers, and they thought I was really pretty cute. They asked me, "Who do you like, the communists or us?" And I said, "Who could like the communists? Aren't they our enemies?" And my mother, a Bible woman, was walking by and she overheard me, and she went into my mother and she said, "I think you better be careful what your little girl says." She says, she shouldn't be so forthcoming in her political opinions. I still am not, right? My mother talked to me and explained that we were here to tell people about Jesus and that we were to love everyone. So a few days later, the command had changed. So the communist soldiers were in our town. And I got the same question: who do you like better, the nationalists or us? And I said, "I love my mommy and daddy." The Chinese soldiers would talk among themselves and discuss what they saw. They particularly liked to talk about people, the foreigners, the Westerners, and what they looked like. Like they were too tall, too thin, too fat, too whatever. But they also said that our noses were too big. And at this point, they thought I was really cute. And they were amazed because Chinese came out of my mouth, out of this blonde head. And they said, "It's too bad. She is so cute now. but she's going to grow up and become as ugly as all the rest of the foreigners. Another time, my mother and I were alone at home. It was wartime, and my sister and brother were away at school in Qingdao, and my father was on a trip in the countryside. In the middle of the night, we were awakened by cannons detonating, and the shots were just whistling overhead. So my mother took me into our food cellar in our kitchen. And I remarked that the fireworks were so amazing and good that night. We had just celebrated Chinese New Year with lots of fireworks, and I thought it was a continuation of that event. It's probably a good thing. As an adult, I can imagine, though, how scared my mom would have been in her attempt to keep me safe. But as I mentioned, we lost no one to enemy fighting. Suddenly one day in May 1948, we were told to pack up and leave. My parents thought that we would return to China in a few years, but that, of course, never happened. It was before commercial planes flew at night, so our trip to Sweden took several days. I think it took about a week, because we made stops in Shanghai, Hong Kong, Bangkok, Calcutta, Bombay, Sharjah, Cairo, Athens, Rome, Geneva, Amsterdam, and finally Oslo, Norway. And from Oslo, we took a train to Stockholm. My only memory of this trip was having to get up early in the morning, every morning, and also some thunderstorms that we flew through. But in Rome, we had a time to go through the catacombs. And I held onto my sister's hand, and I said in my best Chinese, I whispered, "Big sister, is this where they kill the Christians?" I guess that's something I had learned or heard about.
Could you repeat what you said, please?
I said, "Big sister, is this where they killed the Christians?" So I had learned that somewhere along the way. So anyhow, this is how our family looked in 1948. We came back from China looking pretty ragged. My aunt, who was a seamstress, thought that we looked like paupers. We had lived through years of war and had nothing decent to wear. This picture shows that we cleaned up pretty well, don't you think? For a PR picture. We brought Principal Wang with us from China. He was going to spend a year visiting churches with my dad and mom and speaking about China. And remember, this is before days of TV and news flashes and stuff, so people didn't really know what Chinese people looked like or how they were. So he lived with us for that year, and one day he came, he made pot stickers. Don't they look beautiful? My favorite food. Do you all know what pot stickers are? If you don't, you are missing something. Wang returned to China in 1949, and he got on the last plane to fly into communist China from the outside world. Had he not made that plane, he would not have been able to go home to his family. My father had no contact with him until 1983, and then they finally were able to write to each other. But my dad died in 1984 at the ripe old age of 90, so they really never got to see each other, which is a shame. We settled in a small town in Sala, Sweden. My maternal grandmother lived here, and one of my aunts lived there. It was also my mom's hometown. Our family was sort of well known in the town because, who goes to China, after being engaged for 4 months, and our so this would prove both good and bad for me, because if I did anything wrong, there was always someone there to tell my mom. But I was coming from a very primitive life in China to a very clean and orderly Sweden, which was quite a change. The first thing on my agenda was to learn Swedish. I spoke only Chinese, the dialect of our town. I was put into first grade to learn the language, but I was a little too young to start school in Sweden at that time. I came home crying to my mom. Said, "Mom, they're calling me Chinese. They're calling me Chinese." She assured me that they didn't even have a clue what a Chinese person looked like. So here, I came to a country where I looked like everyone else, but I was different because I didn't speak the language and I didn't know the culture. In China, I looked different, but I spoke in the town's dialect. At times, as time went on, I soon learned to speak Swedish and felt at home in my new country and promptly forgot my Chinese, which is a shame. The 4 years I spent in Sweden were great. Sala was a small town. Those of you who went on the choir tour in 1994 will remember that we visited my best friend and her farm, Monica's farm, out in the countryside. And I rode my bike everywhere. I went to school. I took piano lessons. I attended Sunday school and church. I sang in a duet with my best friend, Monica. My grandmother, Hedvig, lived with us during these years in Sala, and my maternal grandmother would come over and take care of us when my parents were out doing deputation work. And she would always make us Swedish pancakes, and they were the best I've ever tasted. Sorry, Kevin. They were awesome. My brother, who was age 14, and my sister, at age 17, thought that the town of Sala was boring, with a capital B. I thought it was wonderful. Our perception of that time was so different, but think of the age difference too. I still feel nostalgic when I go back to Sweden and go to Sala. It's my favorite place to visit and just walk down the streets. But my parents were missionaries, and they wanted to be back in China. It became obvious that that would not be possible. My dad was sent out to the Far East to check out other areas where other mission work could be taking place. He went to Thailand, Hong Kong, and then finally Japan. And I have a feeling that he must have met Paul and Elaine Lewis, because this would have been 1950-51. And they were talking with the American Baptist Foreign Missionary Society. He contacted the ABFMS, and they decided on Japan as the place to be. I often wondered how my parents were able to go to Japan, love the Japanese people, and work among them after all the atrocities they had seen in China during the Japanese occupation. The occupation was from 1937 to 1945. But they were quick to say that the soldiers who treated the Chinese people so brutally were not the people that they were working with, and God's love was for all people. The years in Japan were especially significant years for me, but it came with some loss as well. My sister Alice was 21. She had started nurses training in Sweden, and my brother John was 14 or 17, and he left for Bethel College in St. Paul, Minnesota. So our mission board, well, I was 9 years old. Our mission board had a strange rule that they would only pay for one trip per child, which meant that I had already had half a trip, right, from China to Sweden. And they said, well, she needs to stay home in Sweden. And my mother said, I'm not leaving my 9-year-old in Sweden when I go to Japan. And she said, well, we need to go, and she needs to come with us. The story behind that, too, is that my aunt and uncle had left their son, Roy, who was 12, in Sweden when they had to return to China. They didn't see him for 9 years. And, you know, to say that his feeling about God and mission work was positive is not true. Yeah. So, but somehow they talked them into saying that I could go to Japan as well. Dad went to Japan to begin his work in 1951, and in October 1952, Mother and I began our 76-day journey to Japan. Slow boat to China. We saw the world, stopping in places like Hamburg, Germany, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Lisbon, Marseille, Cairo, sailed through the Suez Canal, Aden, Singapore, Hong Kong, Manila, Moji, Japan, and then finally arrived in Kobe on January 6, 1953. It was a trip of a lifetime, and I remember a lot, and I learned a lot, about the world. It's difficult to say what part of my life is most influential in my development, but Japan was definitely a very important time, from age 10 to 17. There were many changes, so I suddenly became an only child. I lived in a city in Japan where we were the only foreigners. Again, we looked different than people around us, and we didn't know the language. Isn't that a beautiful view? We lived in a typical Japanese house with straw tatami mats. I think the next picture, maybe. That's our typical Japanese house. We had paper windows and sliding doors. It was freezing in the wintertime, and with only a portable gas stove that we carried from room to room. We lived right beside the rice paddies that were fertilized by some very smelly stuff. I started 4th grade at an international school, Canadian Academy in Kobe. I had to learn English and Japanese for when I came home on vacations. I was separated from my parents because I had to live in the dorm and later in a hostel with another missionary family from the Christian Missionary Alliance mission. The first 3-4 months attending CA were horrible. They were tough. I was 10 years old by this time, and I was homesick. I struggled to learn English, was the only Swede, and one of my friends told me years later, he said, he was a Chinese boy, his name was James Mack, and he says, I was so glad to see you come into my class because you knew less English than I did. Misery, loves company. But then there was a gradual change. English entered my brain. I made friends. I loved my teachers, and I got involved in school activities, and life was good. CA, or Canadian Academy, was an international school that began around 1913, and it was mostly then for missionary kids. The school was closed during the wars, but by the time I got there in 1953, it had just opened a year or so before. My graduating class had 21 students, and we came from 10 different countries. Our common language was English. It didn't matter where we came from, what nationality we were, what faith we had, what language we spoke, and what our parents had for an occupation. We came from all walks of life and from every part of the world, and we got along famously. We still have contact. I still have contact with about 8 of our classmates. You know how you come to a place in life where there's a fork in the road? CA was such a place for me. Some Swedish missions had decided to begin a Swedish school with about 10 or 12 students. My parents felt that I should have a broader education than that. So they decided that CA should be the choice. The choice has made the whole difference in my life. Had I gone to the Swedish school, I probably would have returned to Sweden to go to university, but going to CA, I ended up coming over here. My life would have been quite different, and I'm very thankful to my parents for making the choice for me at that time. It was also in Japan that I chose to become a Christian. As an MK, there are lots of expectations, just sort of like PKs. I've never known anything other than living in a Christian home. I was getting plenty of Christian teachings, Bible knowledge, and faith by osmosis. I could quote all kinds of Bible verses, probably more than I know today. But it was in those critical preteen and teen years that I began to take on a faith of my own. It was a time that I knew that I could not depend on my parents' faith to make me a Christian. When I was 13, I was baptized by my dad at the Himeji Baptist Church. And I had to give a testimony in front of the church and tell them why I wanted to be a Christian. When I was living with the Christian and Missionary Alliance missionaries, we had, I really got religion with a capital R. I don't know if you know about the Christian Missionary Alliance group. There were tons of rules we had to follow. We weren't allowed to play games or be outside and play and do homework on Sundays. It was the day of rest, right? We could play quiet indoor games like Bible baseball or write letters to our parents. But we had weekly scripture passages and verses that we had to learn by heart each week. In school, I was very active in the Youth for Christ group that we had. I helped my hostel mother teach, it sounds like a hostel mother teach Sunday school. I sang in the choir and sang duets with my best friend, Joy, and pretty much did things that were expected of me because I was raised to be a good girl. It was in Japan that I became friends also with the American Baptist Foreign Missionaries and their children. We attended all their conferences. And when it was time for me to think of college, the person who influenced me most was Tom and Doris McDaniel, who were missionaries in Yokohama. Later, and they suggested Eastern Baptist College. And later, Tom became a professor at Eastern Baptist Theological Seminary. So at 17, in 1960, I left my parents in Japan and headed to the US by way of Sweden. I was not to see my parents again for 3 years because we had no money to go home over summer vacations. But this trip to Sweden was so I could spend the summer with my sister, whom I had not seen for 8 years. And also to get reacquainted with my grandmothers, my aunts and uncles and friends and so forth. My sister and I discovered that we were so similar in so many ways, in spite of the fact that we had lived apart for 8 years and the age difference of 12 years. I think it must be something in the DNA. I'm not sure. So in September 1960, I set foot in Philadelphia. I was met by my Aunt Edith, who was my father's sister, and she lived and worked in Philadelphia. I had not seen her since I was 6 years old, and that's when she became my favorite aunt because she brought me a doll that could drink and wet. Yeah, she always liked that story. In college, I wanted to be anything. I wanted more than anything to fit in. I wanted to be like everyone else. I didn't want to tell my life story when I was asked, "Where are you from?" I still don't like that question because where am I from? The first evening of freshman week, we had a getting to know you party. Each of us were given 5 pennies and were to give a penny to a person who was from Maine or Pennsylvania or China or Sweden, someone who didn't speak English wasn't the first language, someone with red hair. Well, you get the picture. I ended up with a handful of pennies, and my secret identity was revealed within the first 24 hours of college life. I immediately founded an American Baptist church. I mean, I couldn't go to, most kids who go to college don't go to church, but, it was part of my life. So, and I don't know if the church found me or I found the church. The First Baptist Church of Malvern came on campus with a big white bus that we called Moby Dick. And free transportation was pretty important in those days for poor college kids. And the pastor, his name was David Burrows, and his wife Mina became my family. They had emigrated from Ireland a few years prior to this, and they knew what it felt like to be new in a new country. So I had come to the US with just enough money for my freshman year. And I worked in the cafeteria to cover my room and board. My dad was a missionary, so I had a 25% discount on my tuition. I had to work for the rest. And of course, we were earning like $1.50 an hour, right, at that time. But through David Burrows' influence, he got me set up with a number of ABW circles, and he would have me go and speak to them about Japan. And so I had my little dog and pony show that I would go, and then they would send me a check for $10 or $15 or $20. But another couple who was also influential in my life was Harold and Laura Davis. Harold was the manager of the ABC USA building in Valley Forge, and the building was new at this point, and he offered me an amazing job. The new Holy Donut in Valley Forge was a destination attraction for hundreds of American Baptists because it was a new building. I led tours on the hour of that building every Saturday and Sunday for 2 years. In the summers, I filled in as secretary to vacationing secretaries, and these years gave me a real understanding of ABC and how our ABC denomination works. I knew all the people in all the departments, and I was glad to be part of this group. Also, it was exciting to meet missionaries that came back on furlough because I had met some of them in Japan. It was also at Eastern that I met Jim, who would become my husband. And after marrying and graduating from Eastern, we moved across country to California with all our possessions in a U-Haul, with a broom that held it all together. Jim was to attend the American Baptist Seminary of the West in Covina, and I got a teaching job at Palomares Junior High School in Pomona. At the first back to school night, I was sitting at my desk waiting for parents to come. A middle-aged father peeked in the doorway and said, where's Mrs. Jones? I am she, I said. He looked at me and said, when I was in school, all the English teachers were old. I was 21, but I probably looked like I was 12. From those who don't know, years later, we changed our last name from Jones to Jonell by combining our two last names. So the exciting thing about living in California was that we lived near my brother, John. He had gotten married and had 2 sons. He had moved his family from Minnesota to California, and I had not seen him for 8 years. So I was a kid, 12 years. And we were adults, and I met his wife and his sons for the first time. After seminary, our first church assignment was at the First Baptist Church in Napa, California. This was a great experience for me. I sort of fit into the role of church lady and pastor's wife. You know, it was just easy transition. And the time in Napa was also made even better by the birth of our first child, Christina. But we also had our dreams and other dreams and aspirations. My heart was drawn to Japan, and we wanted to be missionaries. We filled in all the paperwork. I even had an idea of where in Japan I wanted to be. I wanted to be in Kyoto, where my parents had lived. We were accepted by the board, ABFMS board, and we were commissioned and were preparing to go to Japan. But it was not to be. And here was one of those forks, your will, but not mine be done. At this time, there were serious students' riots in Japan, and the board said, you can't go there right now. So we were put on hold. But one evening, we received a call from the area minister in San Francisco, and he said, well, I have a Swedish Baptist leader here in town, and they need a international student pastor in Uppsala, Sweden. Would you be interested? Would we be interested? Really? Of course we were. My parents had retired from Japan and lived in Uppsala. My sister and her family lived in Uppsala, and I would be going home on the mission field, right? With excitement, we said yes, and in March 1969, we moved to Sweden. Uppsala is a university city. The university was founded in 1477. Many international students go there to study, and we worked among these students, often providing care for students who were far from home. And each year, a group of California students, 40 of them, came from the state colleges, and we provided many activities and lots of food for them. We began a group called Families for International Friendship, where we paired Swedish families with international families so that they could get a taste of Swedish customs and traditions. In the 70s also was the time of the Vietnam War, and suddenly large numbers of American deserters came to Sweden, and many of them settled in Uppsala. This became a challenging situation for us, as we needed to help them get acclimated to their new life in Sweden. A highlight in our life in Sweden was that Kevin was born. Isn't he cute? He still is, I know. Having small children in Sweden is wonderful. It is truly a society that nurtures the young. It feels safe. It is truly a child-friendly country. We were active in a small Baptist church. It was also amazing living there with my parents and sister nearby. We had many happy family times together. In addition to our work among the student population, both Jim and I took the opportunity to further our education, and I got my master's in clinical psychology and did my internship as a school psychologist in Sweden. So in 1977, we moved to Denver. We knew immediately which church we would be joining because our best friend from seminary, Jim Elland, was youth pastor here. From the very beginning, we were so impressed by Calvary and its ministry. It was exciting to enter into the work. Our whole family got involved. And throughout the past 40 years, I think I've served on any committee that's been a committee, and taught Sunday school and GPS groups, and helped with special programs. If you want to work here, there's a place for you. But sometimes I have to admit, sometimes I feel like the church lady, if you remember her. Coming back to the US brought other opportunities as well. In 1980, I began work for Littleton Public Schools as school psychologist, first at Goddard, which was then a junior high, and then at Littleton High School. This became my new mission field. I loved my job. I was happy to wake up in the morning. Can you imagine that? To go to work. I worked with some very challenging students, but I felt that this was where I belonged. The special education team that I worked with was an amazing group of supportive, knowledgeable, and fun people to work with. Even after retirement, we were part of a very solid group of good friends. After 36 years of marriage, Jim and I were divorced, and divorce doesn't happen in my family, so this was a pretty tough time. But I am blessed to have my children, and this, I get emotional. And both Christina and Kevin chose to come back to Denver after college. And they have gifted me with two awesome in-law kids, in Jennifer and David. And they have given me 5 amazing grandkids who I have had the opportunity to spend time with from the very time of their birth. I have been able to take each of them to Sweden at different times to show them where their roots are. And I have had the privilege of living close to my family, which has been very significant for me because I decided that if I were ever to have children, I was not going to send them to boarding school. Even though I had a wonderful time at boarding school, the first part of it was really tough. But they didn't. Now we're living so close to each other, we can walk to each other's houses. God is good. Retirement. Oh, I've got to talk fast. I've retired for about 10 years, and I've been busy. But I don't know how I had time to work. I spent a lot of time doing volunteer work here at Calvary, but I'm also very active in the Swedish Women's Educational Association, not Baptist at all, I might say. So I sing in the choir, I'm part of the book club and so forth, and we have about 100 members here in Denver, 7,000 worldwide, and it's an organization that helps Swedish women when they move overseas to acclimate to the community. And also, let's see, I'll skip some things here. In 2008, I spent 8 weeks volunteering in Japan through an international ministries. And I taught kindergarten children in Bible classes in several churches. And I stayed in the Kansai area, which is where I lived when I was a child. In 2010, I spent 8 weeks teaching conversational English in the school that my grandmother actually started. Today, that school has 4,000 students and is considered to be the best in their town. And I have many contacts there. The school put me in a hotel that was right within walking distance to our church, which is where our house was. And the very first day as I was walking there, I went for a walk and I thought I need to find out what's in the neighborhood. I walked along the streets and I felt a peace that surrounded me. And I thought, I've been here before, I've been here before. And the hymn, "We're Standing on Holy Ground." I was walking around that day and I felt I was walking on holy ground. And the melody kept on playing in my mind. I'm standing or walking on holy ground. And I know there are angels all around, for we are standing in his presence on holy ground. I felt that I belonged. It was home. One day, an English teacher came up to me. She had observed my class, and she said, my grandmother had your grandmother as a teacher. I said, "You're kidding. Is your grandmother still alive?" She said, "Yes, she's 91 years old." So the next day we drove out in the countryside and met the grandmother. I have a picture of her up here. And then one of the blessings in life is that I have seen my kindergarten buddy, Fong, and we see each other every time I go back there. During the last year, I've spent most of my time translating a book from Swedish to English. My sister has written a book about our grandmother. It's called Öster om bergen, which in English is going to be East of the Mountains. That's the name of our province, Shandong. And she's written about our grandmother, the 55 years that she spent in China. And I have a copy of her book up here. And the book that I've translated, I think, will be available on Amazon within 2-3 weeks. So I'm excited about that. So now who am I? I'm a third culture kid. A TCK is someone who has spent the majority of her life by the age of 18 in a culture outside her parents' passport countries. In a way, I'm a fourth generation or a fourth culture kid because I include a US before I was 18. What is it like to be a TCK? It can be confusing, but also very exciting. Sometimes I frankly don't know who I am. Am I Swedish, Chinese, Japanese, American? What traditions do I keep? Can I feel at home? I can feel at home in almost any country I find myself. But I also, at times, I feel like a stranger when I go back to those places. Some benefits of being a third culture kid are speaking or understanding several languages, understanding different cultures, and being open-minded about different people, and feeling that you belong almost anywhere. But the challenges can be that you are not rooted anywhere. Where is home? When you leave one place, you always leave part of your heart there. You can feel restless because you wonder, when is it time to leave and go on to the next place? Relationships can be a problem. If you aren't in one place long enough, you may not want to put the work into making friends. Or you may become very possessive of someone who shows you some interest. You may always feel like an outsider. You don't look like your peers. You speak a different language, or you have different customs. You may have difficulty understanding someone who has lived in one place all his life. But you have a easier time understanding people who are living in poverty elsewhere. You may be independent and self-sufficient because you had to be when you were growing up. But sometimes you may wish that someone would just plain take care of you. This book, and you can take a look at it later, it just was an eye-opening experience for me to read because it showed me, oh yeah, other people feel this way too. Do I have time for, oops. Yeah, I've got to tell you one little story about a friend of mine, John, who graduated the year before I did from CA. He came to the United States. He was 18 years old. He had perfect English, perfect Japanese. He had been to the States maybe only 3 times in his entire life. First time he went shopping, the clerk said, "That'll be $4.40. And he said, "Okay, here, $4. And he didn't know how to count out the change. So he had the money in his hand and he said, And she said, well, just give me two nickels and 4 dimes. And he said, what are nickels and dimes? That's how it can be to be a TCK. So Calvary is a place where I've been able to be me without pretense or judgment. It's a place where I feel at home through our pastors, from the legendary Larry Lowhead, who ended almost every sermon with "think about that," to Mary Hulst with her unique way of preaching, her interest in missions, and her ability to bring people together in meaningful ways, to Brad Berglund, who had a special gift of seamlessly combining contemporary, traditional, and Taizé music to make worship more meaningful, to Anne, Morgan, and Alice, who are bringing new styles of worship, involvement in the community, and helping us all be more open-minded and welcoming. I have been challenged and blessed. Our pastors have all provided me with theological insights that make me think, challenge me to act on my beliefs, and sometimes even help me change my opinions. Calvary has given me a portable faith that helps me take on tasks that hopefully will be of benefit to others. At Calvary, I have the opportunity to grow intellectually and spiritually. Here at Calvary, I can live fully as a blessed child of God, and all of you make up an incredibly supportive extended family. Thank you. Too long.
No, oh my goodness.
That's a long 75 years.
It was a good 75 years. So I'm going to offer prayer for Margie, and then I'm pretty sure you'll be willing to stay here if anyone has questions, and you can come look at the photos and books that she has up here. But let us offer a prayer of thanksgiving for Margie. God of creation, we are grateful that you created Margie. In all the places she has lived, you have met her with grace, encouragement, and courage. We are grateful for the ways that she has lived the best she knew how in whatever place she found to call home in that moment. We are grateful for the faith of her ancestors and the ways that they shaped and formed her and passed on a legacy of faith that was nourishing, challenging, and inspiring. We are grateful for the family she has made here in the States and the ways that she has brought the other worlds that she is a part of to our world here, for the many ways that she is continuing the work that is in her heart, in her bones, and in her very soul. We give you thanks, oh God. And we give you thanks for the ways that she is our family as well. And we look forward to all that is to come in her life. And we give you thanks for all that has been. We pray all of this in your gracious and holy name. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh,
Yes.
sorry, you can
Go
sit.
ahead.
Before Dave Crane tells me I forgot something, the men's group is having a sign up for their ice cream social. So when you walk out of the fellowship hall, take a gander to your right and they will sign you up. I didn't forget. Thank you all. We'll see you in worship. Okay. Thanks, Margie.
Thank you.
So